Alleluia. Om Mani Padme Om. Allah Satnam.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Fr Victor Farrugia. He's the parish priest at St Augustine's Church and Burke Street West in CBD Melbourne. With these three programs where we'll be interviewing Fr Farrugia, what we'll be doing is, in the first program, we'll look at his spiritual derivation, where he comes to be where he is today. The second program will be talking about a special project which Fr Victor has undertaken in the past, which is the Oasis project. And in the third, we'll be talking about spiritual direction, which Fr Victor is a spiritual director. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Norm.
Well, you just heard that, so you know I'm going to ask you about your spiritual derivation. Clearly born a Catholic. Yeah. Where did it go from there?
Well, to say I come from Malta, almost like saying I come from Ireland, you know.
That's right.
It's kind of embedded in us for quite a few years. Mm. Yes, I was born there, and before I migrated with my family to Australia, I virtually came here when I was 16. So in Malta itself, I was brought up like a lot of us. Our religion was also part of our social life, or the other way around. And certainly, I suppose I can honestly say to you that we didn't need watches or mobiles because our life was regulated by the church bells. You know, they gave us the time of funeral. So anyway, what I'm saying is, it was there, deeply embedded in the unconscious and the way I lived. And certainly that was a big influence, I would imagine, yes, to my beginnings, really.
Yes.
In terms of my own spirituality and within the, I suppose, the ambit of the Catholic faith.
Well, how old were you when you left Malta to come here?
Yes, I was just turned 16 actually. 16? Yeah, so I'd kind of finished my secondary schooling, and then I kind of worked for a little while in the steps of St. Matthew in the taxation office, and and it wasn't quite as dramatic as Matthew, where he walked past my desk, but I'd been toying with the idea of priesthood, among other kind of thoughts, if you like, of what I'd like to do. And eventually that won the day.
Yes. Well, that coming at 16, you had some fairly solid roots in Malta. So were there any incidences there which sort of started to start this awareness of maybe I might become a priest?
Good question. I probably would have to say it was a combination of things. You know, there was some obviously religious and some not so. For example, I can still remember the first time I ever went underwater with my snorkel. I got this for my birthday, and I distinctly still remember my total fascination with what was underwater. Later on, Jacques Cousteau was one of my heroes who began to film underwater and all that. I don't know, it was something of it took me out of my normal world.
Yes.
I was totally fascinated by this world underwater with all these fish, and Malta's got, as you know, some wonderful clear waters and rocks and stuff. So that was probably one of those moments which expanded my thoughts and the way I looked at life and a bigger world, if you like. And yes, there were some moments, particularly I remember one particular moment when one of our people from our town where I was became a priest actually, and the big celebrations, you know, and everybody turned out, the mass when the bishop came to ordain him. I would have been about six and a half. So, and Yeah, it was the best way, as you would understand, it's very hard to kind of convey fully the experience itself.
Yes.
But it was, in a sense, unitive. In a sense, I felt connected to people, to God, to something deep within me, maybe, in the midst of all this euphoria and the joy of ordaining as priests and all that goes with that. So that's kind of captured my imagination a little bit. Yes. And I suppose that was one of those wonderful moments which I've never forgotten, actually. Where maybe, must have short-circuited with something bigger than my normal way of thinking, So there are a number of little moments like that.
Yes.
They're little, but in fact very deep.
What was the difference? Like, Malta is full of festivals, it's full of incredible churches, and it's full of being Catholic. You came from there to here.
Yes.
What are your memories about that schism, that sort of leaving behind that environment? Did you came to Melbourne? Did you?
We did. Yes. Yeah, we did. And
what did that feel like?
Well, big adjustment. I probably didn't really fully realize that till years later. And surprisingly, it wasn't 2 years later that I began to permit myself to feel the actual grief of leaving Malta.
Yes.
That came years later. It was triggered off by a situation where I took a group to listen to an Aboriginal speaker, an Aboriginal dream time, and what happened and how they went back, and how they were kind of dispossessed, if you remember the stolen generation. And somehow or other, that triggered me into this, of leaving Malta in that sense, a bit of nostalgia and stuff like that. And of course, we came like many migrants looking for a home and a better life. And at this stage, I still wasn't quite sure.
Well, time has caught up, so we'll talk about being sure in a minute.
Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity, and today we're speaking with Fr Victor Farrugia, who's the parish priest for St Augustine's in Burke Street West in the city of Melbourne, that is. Father, we were talking about a fascinating aspect of the transition from being a 16-year-old Maltese youth raised in what was in those days an intensely Catholic environment, and then landing in Australia.
Yes.
And you pointed out that was different. How different?
Well, it was quite different in this sense that wherever I grew up in Malta, it talked about the Knights of Malta, for example. Buildings, I often thought, why am I so fascinated by the Enlightenment and by Renaissance and stuff like that, all those kind of periods. And I realized that the Great Siege really left its stamp on us in 1565 when the Mamelukes attacked and we were going from the south, and somehow or other in the Great Siege of Malta they were stopped there, a bit like the Second World War. And the tremendous sense of faith of being able to stop such a movement, if you like, and that's imprinted in my historical genes, if you like. I remember also, these are kind of little brush marks, if you like, that might give a picture. Growing up, seeing my first big spectacular film, Quo Vadis, where the Christians were being killed, and Ursus, the great strongman, subdued the bull, if you like. So again, with this sense of heroism, was there. And then, of course, the other one, much more down to earth, well, the priests were always close to us in the parish. We had a very close I was part of youth clubs, and kind of there was a good working relationship, if you like. So this was something that captured again, you know, doing good and being effective in generating good, I suppose, goodness in the world today in whatever way.
Yes.
And so coming to Australia, I remember, firstly, the buildings were different. You know, went to the local church, and it looked back in 65. You know, looked like a huge big garage, really. And coming from Malta, where the buildings built with huge big limestone, this felt very kind of temporary, you see. And then, of course, Christmas and Easter, there was no bells, of course. That was quite. It seemed dead, you know, like normally Christmas time the bells are going with every mass, and so you knew there was a festivity. And of course there's no social outward show greatly of, apart from drinking at the pub back then and stuff like that, which was not in my culture in a sense back then. And so the kind of Christmas then ended up being a meal at home, a mess in the morning. You couldn't feel it buzzing in the air, the festivity, so to speak, which would have been in our case. But we would decorate the streets, and you know, you had people mixing stuff like that. So, but then again, I suppose the multicultural nature, the changes, many nations. I was very lucky that I was brought up in Malta, because I grew up with 3 languages: Maltese, Italian, and English. And I could understand and speak quite well.
Yes.
So that was handy. But in terms of religion, I came kind of face to face with faith back in those times, which is still, I think, a bit influenced by the whole Anglo-Irish kind of church a bit, which was something new for me. And a lot more, I suppose, cerebral in some way. Yes. Not as overtly expressive, emotional expression. Yet still quite, you know, in my ken, as feel like what I felt maybe I'd like to do in my life, you know.
So that context is very interesting, and so you've got this schism between the devoutly and overtly Catholic context to this New World type context. That sort of rubbing together of those, how did that rise in you in making a decision for priesthood?
Yes, I probably threw me back into my own, when those kind of seemingly exterior supports went, then I was left to look at me, myself and I to a certain extent. What did I really want to do here? Part of the influence to become a priest was, at that age, it was a possibility for me, in as much as we had lots of priests in the family from both sides of from my mother and father in Malta. So for me it was possible. It was not quite like wishing I was a fireman, but it was something akin to that. I was very interested in the medical world, and also, believe it or not, architecture. So I had 3 things to look at, and I ended up at heart level being attracted to be a priest. I was part of a lay society of Christian doctrine, and that kept me kind of, if you like, marinated in that kind of way of thinking, of wanting to be effective and to be good in the sense of what I walked with people and what I let God do with me in that sense. So that ideal and that sense of life was still in me, maybe deciding to say, well, maybe this is still something I'd like to try.
Yes.
You know. And then I talked to some priests and got lots of encouragement. I was not shy by nature, in a sense, because come from my parents were both in opera and theatre back in Malta with amateur theatre, so I grew up literally running around their feet, you know, they were giving concerts or something. So being in the public wasn't something that I was overly frightened of. So
no, and I'm not overly frightened of time, but we'll run out of for this segment.
right.
So we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony in Diversity, and we're speaking with Fr Victor Farrugia, who's the parish priest at St Augustine's Church in Bourke Street City. In your description of your evolution spiritually, you referred to your heart being connected. How has your heart prospered throughout this point to where you are now? What's been the growth of that heart?
Well, it's nearly 40 years now. No one said. So it's be quite interesting to see how I can put this. Sadly, when we talk about the heart, I suppose we talk about the way I'm accessible in terms of love, in terms of connecting with others, in terms of my love of the Lord. You know, the experiences that I've had from the start in the seminary. I enjoyed theology and philosophy, and they kind of threw me back into this relationship again with Christ, particularly with the power of the Holy Spirit in terms of this kind of presence that, although mysterious, yet very powerful, you know, in terms of connecting me with others, myself. And I suppose many things have strengthened me along the way, some of which would have been my experiences in parish, you know, in terms of the first parishes when I started first preaching or listening to people or teaching particularly.
Yes.
Then, besides that, my own moments of suffering, whether it be rejection or problems that rise up in the normal pastoral context, trying to handle people who are difficult or people who are lost, or to be effective in being a real presence in the lives of those who are struggling. And every time I never forget the second parish, when I effectively was a chaplain in the hospital at Footscray Hospital. And I remember I thought to myself at the end of 3 years doing that, now my seminary training has began, you know. You know, it was moments when I realized that my words sometimes and all my theology was not going to help in terms of being present to someone whose life was being torn by disease, or next to a parent who are losing a child. And all of a sudden, again, my heart began to not be satisfied with cliche answers, or, you know, all of that began to wear very thinly, even though it was maybe right or erudite or whatever. It was totally irrelevant to actually the moment.
Yes.
So I suppose slowly compassion and learning to become truly present, as I was certainly present in some moments to the presence of God in my heart, in moments of sadness, in moments of distress, in moments of helplessness, in standing with, traveling with, being with people, and in my own life, you know, in slowly generating an attitude of openness, which I kind of wasn't quite born with.
No.
And but over the years, slowly but surely, it began to expand itself in that way. So coming here gave me the opportunity for that.
A large part of what you've been describing is actually been learning from other people's hearts and their willingness to expose themselves to you, I suppose. What does it feel like to have someone sitting there completely surrendering their whole beingness to you in trust? How does that feel?
it feels to me very awesome in a sense, you know, that it's a great responsibility. And at times I'm very humbled, because when people are suffering, sometimes nothing like what I've suffered, quite overwhelming for me. And yet somewhere or other they reach out and they say, well, God's helped me through this, you know. I'll never forget this beautiful man. He would have been in his middle 80s, and he was talking to me after his wife passed away. And he was very gently spoken, but quite firm, one of those solid types. And he talked to me about staying next to his wife for nearly 7 years. She had Alzheimer's. Back in those days, they didn't quite call it that, but and virtually every day he'd be next to her, feeding her. She did not know who he was. But Norm, the way his eyes glistened, and there was a sense of, I've been honored to do this with my wife, to be next to her. To this day I can still see his eyes, and totally filled and imbued with what obviously is the deepest and closest I can think of compassion, and a God who's identified in that moment with this man, and through this man to his wife. And I just, it's as if all my training and all my formation, you know, just, goodness me, you know, it just, I thought, this is what I'm called to try to be, you know, with others in that sense. So moments like that, when I've been humbled by walking with others, as you say, and learning to basically shut up and listen, and, you know, truly be appreciative of those to whom I'm called to walk with in the company on the way.
Right. So I can feel what's rising there is perhaps a corroboration of the fact that God's perspective is one of love. That this man exhibited that love.
Yes, it was almost like you're in touch with someone through whose presence you could be present to someone who's not present to you, and yet you can still pour out your love. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That, I mean, that's
absolutely. And I think that's a wonderful place to finish the program today, and you will come back for the next program,
okay.
I hope.
Well,
thanks for watching. We'll be back next week, and we'll be interviewing Father Victor about a little project that he developed, the Oasis Project. We'll see you then.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.